Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Animus in Anime, Metamorphosis from Ovid to Otaku. All that once was directly lived has become mere representation. Guy Debord. There is no more unfortunate creature under the sun than a fetishist who yearns for a woman's shoe and has to settle for the whole woman. Karl Kraus. Well, hi everybody, and today I hopefully won't fall between two stools where I annoy everyone who's not interested in anime and I annoy everyone who is interested in anime but doesn't like the classics. So I've expertly chosen to go right between the middle to alienate as many people as possible. But to be serious, what I'm going to look at today is this is a depiction of the myth of Pygmalion. And it's often referred to, the title of this painting is Pygmalion and Galatea. But Galatea, that is the name given to the statue that comes alive in the story. But Galatea was a name given, I think it was the late 1700s, so the statue was unnamed in classical times when Ovid was writing. So this is the notion of the sculptor falling in love with his own creation. And I wanted to explore that in relation to some modern day goings on in Japan. And I'm not picking on the Japanese, because what I'm going to explore as we go along is how I think what to some Western eyes might seem extreme and weird is actually maybe in many ways just a potentially exaggerated example of trends that already exist in the West that maybe we're not as aware of as we should be. So I'll deconstruct, or I'll explain some of the terms in the title. It will all make sense, but I understand that the depiction you're seeing there is not a depiction. The real life woman standing in the street is in this maid outfit, and I'm not going to go on and on about it. Some type of feminist argument about the objectification of women and stuff. It's obviously that, but there's a lot more going on. So it just fascinates me that this type of phenomenon, where in the case of Galatea, let's call her that, this statue becomes lifelike, or in the case of the Japanese maid dressing up cosplay type idea, the maids are actual women who have their personalities reduced to this weird visual stereotype. So they're moving in the opposite direction, which I find interesting. But this is the concept of the otaku. It's just an anime portrayal of the otaku, who in turn, I will go in to lots of detail because I'm exploring anime and otaku in various ways in future. So I understand there's nuance, and I don't want people shouting at me that you've given an overly simple definition. But for working purposes, the otaku are basically very invested, very knowledgeable fans of things like anime and manga. And I'll explain as we go along. So initially the term was pejorative. It was a put down, and I'll trace in future videos the whole derivation and first use of the term. But I believe it's otaku is a second person pronoun, basically you, but it's a particular form. But we'll get into that, like I said, a future date. For today's purposes, otaku are borderline obsessed, or more charitably fascinated by and expert on the topic of anime and manga. And the argument is also that there are different types of otaku. So in the West, what you'd call train spotters might be termed train otaku. And it evidences itself in various ways. So that's a horrible phrase, evidences. Apologies for that. I must have picked it up somewhere. It's an atrocious misuse of the English language. It's manifested in instances like this. So the idea that you put an anime figure on your moped, and we'll get into the actual iconography of these anime figures. I find them disturbing and interesting at the same time. And this is the type of can't say it's a standard Japanese bedroom, but you get the idea. And I first came across this bizarrely. There's a bilingual Japanese guy. I don't know whether he's mixed race, he has Western parents or one parent, but he's called a Japanese fan in Japan. So he follows Liverpool Football Club. So I accidentally came across him. And he's talking about Liverpool Football Club, but he obviously has a sideline in doing anime, manga, otaku type things. And the studio from which he films is basically one of the rooms in his apartment. And it's absolutely covered in these figurines, really weird figurines. So that's how I first came across it. And then this is the Akihabara area of Tokyo. And throughout this talk, if I mispronounce either classical terms or Japanese terms, 1,000 apologies. I will go and commit seppuku in the corner of the room with a tablespoon for extra pain. No, but seriously, apologies to any Japanophiles or Japanese people as I butcher the Japanese language. But it almost hurts my eyes to look at it. For somebody who lives in the countryside and appreciates nature and is borderline raging misanthrope, I do find this garishness. And you can imagine how busy it is. But it's an area of Tokyo that's famous for anime and manga type activities. So I think I've covered, anime and otaku, and then you have in the title the notion of animus. So it's got two meanings. As a noun, it's hostility or ill feeling. And I've put in the description, I do think there's an element of to what extent I've already looked at the withdrawn shut-ins, hikikomori, in Japan, the people who don't go out and obviously have hostility or ill feeling or some psychological disturbance to the rest of society. And I get the sense that in anime, we'll explore it in much more depth. But there's maybe a slight element, there's this lack of comfort or a rejection of standard reality. But like I say, don't want to make loose claims. I'll go into that in future in a lot of detail. So there's an element of that I'm using in the title, but it's mostly to do with this second definition of motivation to do something. So what is the motivation behind anime? That's what interests me. But more than that, what I want to do is link it to this concept of metamorphosis. I've got this habit of saying metamorphosis in my head, and I know it's not that. So if I do that, sorry, metamorphosis. So the noun, a complete change of character, appearance, or condition. So I'm going to look at Ovid and how he approaches in his work, the famous work, the Metamorphoses, plural, which is based upon this constant change and the fluidity of reality, which I think is interesting. But I thought this would provide very useful context and background from the live stream on the 20th of September. And after that, I'll do another follow-up video. I'm going to look at Kafka's Metamorphosis. So I think this gives the background to some of the issues that Kafka, from which his work came. So I'm not claiming that all of what I'm going to talk about is obviously directly relevant to Kafka, but I do think a lot of the themes I'm talking about today, with reference to Ovid particularly, Kafka didn't get to see modern Japan, obviously. But in terms of Ovid, and even in terms of the alienation aspects of Japanese culture, I do think it's relevant to Kafka, who was ahead of his time. He very early identified the alienating features of modernity. So all of this, I think, will be useful background for when we do look at Kafka. But this is a sample of some of the stuff I've been looking at. So this video took a bit longer to produce than I'd liked it to have, because I've been down more rabbit holes than a hyper-caffeinated fox. I've been just going into so much depth on Ovid. And this is just a sample because on the top left corner, the white front, D.E. Hill, he's done a translation. It's a bilingual, so you have the Latin on one page and you have the English translation. And it's not a totally literal translation, but it's pretty much word for word. Below that is I've given quotes when I've looked at Narcissus. I've used this translation by a guy called Rolf Humphreys. And if you want an accessible version of Metamorphoses, I recommend that Rolf Humphreys translation. But as we'll see as we go along, to say it's inaccurate would be unfair. This is the point about translation. It's incredibly difficult not to do some type of violence to the original language. And whilst, in my humble opinion, the Humphreys translation reads really well and in a modern idiom, there are, as we'll shortly see as we go along when I look at the text in a bit more detail, there are some choices that are made that sacrifice absolute accuracy for an easier tone. So to combat that, and this is why I just went down these rabbit holes, because I'm just fascinated by the act of translation. And I think in a previous video I referenced George Steiner's work After Babel, which I thoroughly recommend. It's a brilliant book about the whole notion of translation, even within a language. So in that book he talks about how Shakespeare's been received across different generations, and how it's almost impossible to understand the exact mindset of an Elizabethan Englishman as they experience life, because certain terms and words had completely different meanings. And it's one of the fascinating aspects of translation and the classics. There's an element of them that stays true and is of interest almost eternally to all people, which makes them classics. But there are also large elements that are not translatable. And I'm always intrigued by what can't be translated and why. So on that basis, the green cover there is the Latin, it's just one edition of the whole of the text of Metamorphoses in just Latin. There's no English text there, apart from the footnotes and stuff. And then the bottom right is a brilliant, if you've got the money and you're as nerdish as me, and I do think there's an irony, I'm not blind to the irony that I'm going to be talking about Otaku today, who tend to be obsessed about particular aspects of Japanese culture. And my obsession with Ovid in the last few weeks has reached Otaku levels of detail. So this, a commentary on Ovid's Metamorphoses, it doesn't actually have the text, but it's a line-by-line commentary upon the text that will refer to the original Latin, if that makes sense. So at no point do you ever see the full text, but there'll be phrases picked out line by line, incomplete phrases often, that these editors, it's talk about a work of love and dedication. It's a stunning 3-volume line-by-line analysis. So I've been working my way through that as well. But like I say, if you've got the money, the time, and the inclination, I couldn't recommend the Barchiesi is the general editor, an Italian guy, and my eyesight's going. Gianpiero Rosati, and there's various. I think they Reed is the surname of one of the English editors, but there's a whole collaboration of scholars with the two Italian main editors, and it's just talk about detail. It's absolutely, it goes into the origins, the etymology of the words, the cross references. So an Ovid mentions turning into stone, which happens quite often. They will give you the full references across the 250 stories that make up the Metamorphoses, and there's just so much background history. It's if you're an Ovid otaku, it really is good. But anyway, I'm bore you senseless with that textual information. So there it is. Better for my eyesight, this. Alessandro Barchiesi, the general editor. And I'm just quoting one in his introduction. I think he makes a brilliant point about how we receive Ovid's work today. So he says, the stories Ovid takes up and transforms are in large part shared, and at times have the social relevance typical of Greek myth, but they are not really binding. They are not objects of faith or orthodoxy, and do not foster religious practice in any direct way. Rather, they border upon it. The poem comprehensively illustrates the paradox that what we inherit from the past is not so much experience but a sort of unlived reality, an imaginary time and place that no one has truly lived through. And this excerpt spoke to me because I just think when I'm comparing the metamorphosis in Pygmalion and in, I will go back to the myth of Narcissus, the metamorphoses that Ovid's writing about in the 250 stories in various shapes and forms, it's a Roman interpretation of Greek original myths. So there's a translation going on straight away by Ovid of the original Greek before we then look at it, often in English. But this bigger point, so that's one obvious translation and metamorphosis of language and how it's received. But then the way in which a whole world is created. The poem comprehensively illustrates the paradox of what we inherit from the past is not so much experience, but a sort of unlived reality. I just think the phrase unlived reality is largely what happens in anime and manga and the world of the otaku. And I'll explain shortly the ways in which it is part of reality, the world of the otaku, but there are various alienated aspects of Japanese culture in general that they are this weird paradox. They're living in a reality, but they're not living in a certain sense because they have some very odd practices that only lonely people would really need, which, like I say, I'm not making general claims. I'm going to give you specific examples very shortly. An imaginary time and place that no one has truly lived through. I think it's a great description of literature in general, and this goes directly to, as we go along and I'm developing some of my ideas about Ovid, an imaginary time and place that no one has truly lived through. I think that describes literature. It has elements of being an unlived reality, but this imaginary time and place that no one has truly lived through, but it feels like you have. So that begs the question, if I'm going to criticize Otaku, or people in general might criticize Otaku for living in a hyper-real world that isn't real, it's part of their imagination. Arguably, literature does that too, as far back as a classic like Ovid's Metamorphoses. So what would be the difference between literature's taking you to an alternate reality and the world of anime and manga? And that's something I'm interested in exploring. His epic opus is a fundamental contribution to the modern European invention of the classical as a second identity or alternative identity. And again, there is this notion of classical learning where people almost adopt it like a coat. And that's again arguably what Otaku do with their culture centered around manga and anime. So, to repeat, what I'm interested in exploring is why might one element of this alternative identity or second identity, the role playing that I'm about to show you examples of in an anime rich culture, why would that be necessarily better or worse, or is it neutral compared to classical literature and art? And the whole theme of this channel is I think there's something unique about classical art and literature. Not to necessarily just automatically, lazily, knee-jerk, disparage things like anime and manga, but I would argue there is a qualitative element of classical culture that actually makes it more substantively important and valuable than some contemporary cultural manifestations. So, as I say, rather than just make that bold claim, it might take quite a few videos to get into the real meat of this, but I want to show you why I still think Ovid's alternative identity and the reality he creates is ultimately a healthier version of the type of imaginative alter reality, hyper reality that the Otaku have created for themselves. And why I'm claiming that is, I'd say there's a distinction between what I've just made these terms up just to give an idea of what I want to talk about in future. But I would suggest that when you look at good art or when you read a good book, you engage in this notion of, like I said, I've just made the phrase up, but I think it captures what I want to describe: absorbed reflection. So you're absorbed, it takes you somewhere else, but you're actively reflecting. And you can compare and contrast that arguably with addictive distraction, which I would not totally, so I'm not going to just constantly criticize anime or manga. I do think the more I've looked into it, there are some interesting aspects of it. So I'm not just claiming it's a addictive waste of time. A better example of pure addictive distraction would be the observable tendency of people to constantly check their mobile phone. It impacts upon their experience of so-called reality, everyday reality. They, in real time, face-to-face time, people are still constantly distracted and addicted. The dopamine hits of their latest telephone message, which, call me cynical, but 99 times out of 100 won't exactly be earth-shattering messages, yet people act as if they are. But in future, when I look at anime, I think there are distinctions to be made. So just off the top of my head, Spirited Away, the famous anime film, there's an artistic quality to it that you actually look at certain frames as almost like you're looking at a painting. You have a few seconds to do so before the film moves on. And then there's a famous early anime film called Akira, which the animation is much more basic and the quality of the images is much lower. Not to say it's not an interesting film for other reasons, but there are visual differences within the medium of anime and manga. There's borderline brilliant art, and there's also much kitschier culture industry type material. So it's not just one homogenous lump. I do think there are distinctions to be made, but at the end of the day, I would still argue that there's a binary distinction I would make between the absorbed reflection of good art, and I'll try and give examples from Ovid, versus addictive distraction, which I think is much more common in contemporary popular culture. So, from a philosophical point of view, just to develop this a little bit, here we have Ovid. I think he died in 18 AD. And in future, I'm going to look at the concept of, from Karl Marx, commodity fetishism. It's difficult to say. But the commodity fetish is a transformation in, I think it's section 4 of the first chapter of Das Kapital. He talks about the mysterious qualities, is it the theological niceties and metaphysical subtleties of the commodity form. The commodity fetishism and the secret thereof, I think the section's called. And it's a brilliant piece of writing. I'm going to look at it in detail, but what is a commodity? And how does it transform itself? How does it undergo a metamorphosis to become something that dominates people's lives? So Marx is talking about that from a philosophical point of view. This is Theodor Adorno, an illustration of him, who's one of my favourite theorists because a Jewish intellectual, German Jew who escaped in the 1930s, the rise of fascism, went to live in America. But God bless him, the Americans basically saved his life. But he spent the next few decades criticizing American culture. And he had this concept of the culture industry, which he developed in depth, which goes on from the notion of commodity fetishism in much more detail. And I still think it's profoundly relevant and important. But within academia, Adorno has a bad name, and I want to look at one of his essays about, I'm trying to remember the precise title, but it's regressive listening and the fetishism of music or something like that. But it's an article all about fetishism with specific reference to music, and he made himself very unpopular because he dared to criticize jazz. And I think it's more complicated. People misunderstand the context from which he was speaking and actually which type of jazz he was talking about. But he chose as an example of his time in the first half of the 1900s. He was criticizing jazz as an example, sorry, of how a commodity, how music can be commodified and pacified and lose its edge, even in formats that pride themselves on being edgy, like jazz. But like I said, it's a really contentious area, which is why I thought it'd be interesting to look at it in future. So his jazz essay will be looked at. And this is a guy, Martin Heidegger, I wrote a book on in the past, who, from an existential point of view, this idea of the way in which we're thrown into the world as an existential question, and the way in which we might become alienated from that world. So he has The Age of the World Picture was a famous essay he wrote, and he talks about, there are complex German terms I'll go into on another occasion, but ultimately the essence of it is that there's a notion of false subjectivity, that we as individuals in a highly technologized world, we don't confront reality in an authentic manner. We suffer from, Marx talked about false consciousness. I think Heidegger talks about false subjectivity. So these are all ways of thinking about Ovid's Metamorphoses from a philosophical point of view. And then the next examples are also philosophical, but they deal much more directly with the specifics of media technologies. So we've got Ovid again, but Marshall McLuhan, a couple of people have mentioned him in the comments, and I want to look at his magnum opus, Understanding Media, which is a brilliant book. And again, one of his theories is that the media environment in which we live, the global village that he wrote about, there's an implosion whereby the human psyche has imploded because of the effects of technology. And he didn't live to see the smartphone or all these very invasive, even more implosive forms of technology. Then there's my mate Jean Baudrillard, who I think is absolutely brilliant. And he described, I saw an interview once where he mentioned his work was never particularly well received in Japan. And he wasn't being precious, but he asked a Japanese interviewer the Japanese interviewer asked him why he thought that might be true. And Baudrillard replied, Japanese people seemed to think that he was just describing reality. They didn't see why it was particularly theoretically interesting. And I do think a lot of Baudrillard's work is a really insightful commentary on some elements of otaku culture and the hyperreal nature of the Akihabara area of Tokyo that I showed you. That's almost like a working model of the hyperreal. And then this is Guy Debord, who I quoted at the beginning, but he wrote a brilliant book that consists of a series of aphorisms or short paragraphs called The Society of the Spectacle, where he basically it's similar in some ways to Baudrillard and McLuhan. You can see them as all linked. But these are the type of theorists, I've just given a very brief overview of the philosophical and the media theorists who, a couple of thousand years after Ovid, almost, are talking about some of the same processes that I think are implicit in Ovid's work, which again is I think it's one of the outstanding features of classical literature, that it speaks to such profound truths about human essence that even in a highly technologized world, it's still very apposite and relevant. But just to dive into, because I risk just talking about these theorists in broad brushstrokes, to give you some specific examples of elements of otaku culture and how it relates to Ovid and specifically the notion of Pygmalion. So you here have Agalmatophilia. So it's a paraphilia, which is a psychological phrase used to refer to an abnormal sexual desire, characterized by attraction to a statue, doll, mannequin, or similar object. So you can see why Pygmalion fits into this perfectly. And it's from the stem of the ancient Greek word agalma for statue, and then philia, fraternal love. And again, in a future video, there are 5 or 6 Greek words for love in different forms. So agape is the American author William Gaddis wrote a book called Agape, which is about the type of ecstatic love you might feel in a religious experience. And for so-called classical ancient people who we think of ourselves as much more technologically superior to, we have our vocabulary. It's one of my pet themes that we've become less and less literate, but our vocabulary for love is actually much more limited than the ancient Greeks and Romans, their vocabulary. So I love you isn't exactly as profound as the way the ancient Greeks and Romans had all these nuanced definitions of the term. But what definitely I do find strange, to bring all this around back to Japan, is these dolls, this paraphilia obsession with these dolls, I do find very odd. So this is a Tokyo department store devoted to them. And this is one of the figurines. Certainly well provided for in the sword department. And I'll get into, like I say, a future date, the issue about the huge eyes and the almost prepubescent nature of the girls, which is the very Lolita-like, very odd quality that's going on. And then I thought this was quite interesting because of when I later show paintings of Pygmalion creating his statue, the way this particular figurine almost grows from the flint, slate, rock that she's standing on, which I found quite interesting. But the whole, I'm looking for a word. I can't do much better than just say kinky. There's just a very odd, from Western eye at least, Western eyes, there's a very odd, weird element to this type of interest in figurines. And as I've just shown you, the whole department store's devoted to them. So there's obviously a cultural difference. There's something's lost in translation, which, given that translation is one of the themes I'm interested in, we'll keep talking about. But with reference to anime, so this is an anime figurine, but within anime there is this concept of tsundere. So it's derived from 2 Japanese words, tsuntsun, the onomatopoeia meaning cold, aloof, or hostile. Dere dere, the onomatopoeia meaning affectionate, lovey-dovey, or sweet. So it's this combination, it's binary opposites. Put together, tsundere describes a person who alternates between these 2 opposing attitudes, often starting off cold or harsh. The sun phrase to eventually reveal a softer and more affectionate side, the dere phrase. The dynamic personality shift usually plays out over time. And it's this contrast that leads a unique charm to tsundere character. And here we have such an example from anime. So basically, it's a Japanese version of a meanie girl. But a meanie girl with a heart of gold underneath, but you have to work hard excavating to find the seam of gold. So that's one example of the way in which anime has these caricatured characters. But this is how it leaches into actual reality. So this is, in Japan, what's known as a maid cafe. So grown-up adults go to these places and you're waited on, and the maids may sing karaoke and just act in a very character driven way and not as their own individual personalities. So you can't beat symbols and a cake and weird headgear. And this is the type of cheesecake you might be served at one of these places. And apparently they are very popular, and you're only allowed an hour and a half because of the waiting times, and just very, very odd. And you think that might be odd. We're just about to get a bit odder. This is a cafe called it's Sonyea, I think it's called, in Tokyo, and it's called a cuddle cafe. And these are becoming more and more popular. It's basically for lonely Japanese people who don't get enough physical comfort. You can actually lie in one of these little bed areas with a paid person, and there's no sexual contact involved, but you're allowed at various price levels. You're allowed to stare at them, put your head in their lap, be stroked. Like I say, nothing sexual, but these cuddle cafes are to help salarymen and people who struggle to get a girlfriend, basically, to feel some human contact. Again, just very odd, but interesting in the way in which the idea, again, we'll shortly see how this might relate to the whole Pygmalion story. The way in which Pygmalion felt alienated from his own society, which is mentioned explicitly just before Ovid's Pygmalion story begins, and I'll give you precise details on that. But just because, in case we haven't dealt with the whole weird stuff, the tsundere maid, you can all they mix the genres, so you can also have a maid cafe that's tsundere, meaning the maids act quite cruelly. So they can be nice one moment and nasty the next. They slam your food down and do all these things. In a Western context, it's just being married. But Japanese people decide to pay good money for this, so, who's to question? And this is, I'm just giving you random examples now, but this is I think he's Australian. He was a stuntman and a professional wrestler, and he started a tribute band called He's Lady Baby. And I think this was a previous band. I can't remember which came first, but this is Baby Beard. I think this might have been the first one. So they just bop around to J-pop, and this is all deemed to be just pop culture. So all of this, I'm giving you the contemporary context. I'm just careful what I'm saying. This is all the contemporary context to give some type of background to how relevant the Pygmalion story from Ovid's Metamorphoses actually is, because I think it addresses a lot of what I've been showing you from, just to repeat, almost 2,000 years ago. So this is the paragraph just before the myth of Pygmalion begins, and it's the second of two incidents of Venus's anger. So even so, the others, the foul Propoetides, would not acknowledge Venus and her divinity, and her anger made whores of them, the first such women ever to sell their bodies, and in shamelessness they hardened. Even their blood was hard. They could not blush any more. It was no transition, really, from what they were to actual rock and stone. So the Propoetides are women that were punished by Venus, and they became, and it's debated in classical studies whether it was a myth or it actually happened, the concept of sacred prostitution. So women who were prostitutes in the surroundings of a temple serving the goddess Venus. There's at least one book claiming this is just made up and it never actually happened. But anyway, it just fascinates me in an era of people like Bonnie Blue and Lily Phillips and these sexual marathons they set up to make publicity for themselves. This idea that shamelessness, something lacking, that you can turn yourself into some type of, to talk about metamorphosis, you can turn yourself emotionally into stone. You see examples of it nowadays, which, again, just to repeat, shows you the relevance of Ovid. So that I'm now going to start the actual tale of Pygmalion. And I'll explain the illustrations and afterwards. They're paintings from a series called Pygmalion and the Image by a guy called Edward Burne-Jones. And the ones that accompany the text from 1878, after I've read out the text, I'll also show you the ones he did a decade earlier to show you how they evolved just out of interest for the visual art aspect of it. But anyway, this is the Ovid, the original Pygmalion story. One man, Pygmalion, who had seen these women leading their shameful lives, shocked at the vices nature has given the female disposition only too often, chose to live alone, to have no woman in his bed. But meanwhile, he made with marvellous art an ivory statue, as white as snow, and gave it greater beauty than any girl could have, and fell in love with his own workmanship. The image seemed that of a virgin, truly, almost living, and willing, save that modesty prevented, to take on movement. The best art, they say, is that which conceals art, and so Pygmalion marvels, and loves the body he has fashioned. He would often move his hands to test and touch it. Could this be flesh, or was it ivory only? No, it could not be ivory. His kisses, he fancies. She returns. He speaks to her, holds her, believes his fingers almost leave an imprint on her limbs, and fears to bruise her. He pays her compliments and brings her presents, such as girls love, smooth pebbles, winding shells, little pet birds, flowers with 1,000 colours, lilies and painted balls, and lumps of amber. He decks her limbs with dresses, and her fingers wear rings which he puts on, and he brings a necklace and earrings and a ribbon for her bosom, and all of these become her, but she seems even more lovely naked, and he spreads a crimson coverlet for her to lie on, takes her to bed, puts a soft pillow under her head, as if she felt it, calls her darling, my darling love. And Venus's holiday came round, and all the people of the island were holding festival, and snow-white heifers, their horns all tipped with gold, stood at the altars, where incense burned, and timidly Pygmalion made offering, and prayed, if you can give all things, O gods, I pray my wife may be, he almost said my ivory girl, but dared not, one like my ivory girl. And golden Venus was there, and understood the prayer's intention, and showed her presence, with the bright flame leaping thrice on the altar. And Pygmalion came back where the maiden lay, and lay beside her, and kissed her, and she seemed to glow, and kissed her, and stroked her breast, and felt the ivory soften under his fingers, as wax grows soft in sunshine, made pliable by handling. And Pygmalion wonders and doubts, is dubious and happy, plays lover again, and over touches the body with his hand. It is a body. The veins throb under the thumb, and Pygmalion is lavish in his prayer and praise to Venus. No words are good enough. The lips he kisses are real indeed. The ivory girl can feel them, and blushes and responds, and the eyes open at once on lover and heaven, and Venus blesses the marriage she has made. The crescent moon fills to full orb 9 times, and wanes again, and then a daughter is born, a girl named Paphos, from whom the island later takes its name. So I just think in terms of the idolatry towards dolls and statues, the paraphilia I described earlier, it's an amazingly detailed description. And just to go back to these images, this is the Pygmalion and the Image series from Edward Burne-Jones. So to repeat, this is the 1878 version, and the first one's called The Godhead Fires. And this was the earlier version, so you can see how it evolved and became softer. This is a study for Pygmalion from 1870. I think it's pretty impressive. It's charcoal. And then I just wanted to give, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on the actual text, that's for another day. But I just wanted to show how one single phrase, the translation difficulties, which make it frustrating and fascinating in equal measure, if you ask me. So this is the Humphreys, and her anger made whores of them, the first such women ever to sell their bodies. And this is the original Latin. And this is my amateur translation. If you're going to translate it literally, it would be something like, because of their godly wrath, their shapely bodies were the first taken publicly. So Ferentor is carried or taken. It's just incredibly difficult. There are so many, as I'm going to show you in a second, different ways of translating. It just never ceases to intrigue me. But this is in the companion commentary, the big 3-volume epic on Metamorphoses by one of the editors, J.D. Reed. The majority reading, in other words, this is what most people accept is in the text, the original text. The majority reading, corpora conforma, works as a hendiadys. Their shapely bodies, with the word forma anticipating their change of shape. Corpora conforma, and that's an alternative that some scholars have claimed was the original. So obviously, because of the length of time that's passed, the original manuscripts are debated over. So the phrase corpora conforma works as a perhaps more pertinent solipsis. Along with prostituting their bodies, the propotides cheapen their good name and meta-narratively broadcast their myth. And then you get into, I'm just, like I said, I won't spend a lot of time on this, don't worry, but just the specifics of the language used, and my point about how linguistically sophisticated this type of literature was 2,000 years ago. So hendiadys, a figure of speech used for emphasis. So you're using conjunction instead of subordination. So nice and warm instead of nicely warm. So corpora conforma, the point is corpora is already a body. You don't really need the former. But it acts as a re-emphasis. And solipsis, applying the same single word to the others it governs in a distinct sense. So in other words, it can be both literal and metaphorical. His boat and his dreams sank would be an example. So the idea is that corpora conforma, that their bodies had fame, and obviously their bodies didn't literally have fame, but metaphorically, because they sold themselves into prostitution, they became infamous. And when I look at Narcissus in future, there are sentence structures whereby there are reflections, the various rhetorical phrasings and devices used in Latin that meta-narratively reflect the whole theme of reflection, because Narcissus is looking in this mirror-like pond. So the language replicates the theme in a stunning way that's so sophisticated. But I just want to very quickly show you this whole concept of translation and how different it can be. So Again, I think this is the Humphreys translation. And in shamelessness, they hardened. Even their blood was hard. They could not blush anymore. It was no transition, really, from what they were to actual rock and stone. So that's the original Latin. And this would be my more literal translation. And as shame gave way and blood hardened, a small change turned mouth into rigid flint. There's just so much leeway. That is a much more word-by-word literal translation I've provided there. And if, by the way, there are any retired Latin teachers or anyone out there, if I've made any boo-boos, because this is complete amateur hour, please let me know. I'm not presenting myself as a Latin expert at all. But I'm just trying to give you, the viewer, a sense of how much leeway are in translations. And this was, again, the Pygmalion in the image. This one's called The Heart Desires. Again, Edward Burne-Jones. And this was the 1878 version. And this is the much darker version. This is called The Hand Refrains. This is The Soul Attains. So it's almost like this is oil, but oil paint, but it actually looks like pastel almost. And again, this is the later 1878, and this is the 1868 to 9. And this was a study. And then this was this is a statuette, Auguste Rodin, from 1908 to 1909, Pygmalion and Galatea. And I had to split this talk up into several, so apologies, but just to quickly mention the whole notion of ivory. If you think about it, and in these classic works, the symbolism underlying the things they're describing is incredibly sophisticated. So I think it's Virgil's Aeneid. The gates of the underworld are in ivory. And I think I'm trying to remember, I think the Greek root of ivory is also the same as deceitfulness. And in Greek and Roman mythology, ivory is associated with, it's a complex substance, because if you think about it, it's inanimate, a bit like stone, but also it comes from living creatures. So this is why it's involved in the underworld, in figurations of the underworld, because it has aspects of death and life as well. But specifically with reference to Pygmalion, everybody, I couldn't find, and please let me know if you can find one, I couldn't find a depiction that actually had the statue that's been come to be called Galatea. But if it was made of ivory, it would be really small. You couldn't get an ivory life-size statue unless you just cobbled together separate bits of ivory. And the paintings never portray that. The paintings always portray life-size statues made of ivory. So this raises the whole, it fascinates me because you're basically just taking for granted the investment the artist has in his work. The projection literally projects and makes it larger than it actually is, which is an aspect of all art. But what's interesting is when you see something that there's actually in the correct proportions and it looks weird, because you take this magnifying projection of art for granted. So just to give you a quick example, like I said, I'll go into this in a lot more depth in future, but this is called Landscape with the Adoration of the Golden Calf by Claude Lorrain from 1653. And obviously the golden calf here looks tiny, but if it was made of gold, you're not going to get a massive life-size calf, are you? But I assume that most people, when you think of the golden calf and people dancing around worshipping it, and Moses getting cheesed off with the whole thing, but you would think it would be real. And in other depictions, it's much more life-size. But this painting fascinated me because this is much more realistic in a certain sense, yet unrealistic in an artistic sense. But now I want to just finish off by looking at, again, 3 different translations of a key part of the Pygmalion story. So the first is the Humphreys. The second is from a PhD that I'll be quoting from in future. That's all about Ovid from a feminist perspective, interestingly. And then the last one is the Lively and the Hill translations are relatively literal, whereas the Humphreys uses more poetic license. But again, sorry if I'm banging on the same old drum, but fell in love with his own workmanship, conceived a passion for his own work, fell in love with his own work. But there's ambiguity, so that's relatively straightforward, that bit. But he successfully carved snow white ivory and gave it a beauty such as no woman could be born with, and gave it greater beauty than any girl could have, and gave it a beauty with which no woman could be born. And this goes to the Otaku and and at least some of them, their obsession with these doll-like portrayals of women. It's something I want to explore in future, but the unrealistic, and this is what's confusing about the Pygmalion statue. It comes alive, but at the beginning it's described as being preternaturally beautiful. No woman could be like this. And it seems to be an aspect of anime and manga, is that these are unrealistic portrayals of women that men are becoming really invested in. And again, just to give you an example of the range of the translations that go on. And I'll look at in a second this phrase here, the best art, they say, is that which conceals art. It's quite a famous phrase from the Metamorphoses. So Humphreys jazzes it up a bit. The best art, they say, is that which conceals art. Hill, his art was so hidden by his art, more literal and lively. Sorry, there's a missing E. It should be Liveley. Naughty me. To such an extent is art hidden by art itself. Sorry, you're just indulging. This is the last one, but it's my otaku-like obsession with the nuances of translation. I'm probably completely wrong. I just thought it might be relatively interesting just to see some of the range. But just more specifically to look at this. This is a independently famous phrase from what you've just seen. So this is the Humphreys translation. The best art, they say, is that which conceals art. And this is how it's referred to. Art is concealed by its own artifice. Art lies by its own artifice. And the whole notion of the relation, it's a huge issue in and of itself, but the relationship between art and how it represents what it's representing. So in theatre, you'd call it the suspension of disbelief. You get absolutely absorbed by what you're watching. And at the conscious level at which you go to the theatre when you arrive, you know this is make-believe. But the test of a really good play is that you momentarily and temporarily suspend your disbelief and you become absorbed by the process. In Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, he describes how ancient Greek tragic theatre was incredibly sophisticated at drawing you in because of the music, the role of the chorus, the atmospheric nature of a Greek theatre that's open air, it's dark, there are lights, the shadows. It must have been an absolutely incredible experience. But this relationship, because the Otaku know that these figurines are completely fake, yet simultaneously invest in them as if they're real. And one of the things I'd like to explore in future is to what extent does art constantly concentrate upon the act of reflection, literally and metaphorically. So Narcissus is a great example. Narcissus is looking at his own reflection, but the reader is reflecting upon Narcissus looking at his own reflection. It's a meta-reflection. And I'd suggest that's an embodiment of what art does, contained within the story of Narcissus. And within the story of Narcissus, in future I'm going to show you how certain key phrases and sentence structures act to reflect. And within the 250 stories of the Metamorphoses, Ovid reflects within the themes of those 250 stories. There are reflections as he goes along. It's just incredibly sophisticated. And then Oscar Wilde's always good for a quote: to reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. So it's this paradoxical ambiguity of art. It wants to conceal, but it's in the act of concealment that art reveals itself. And then this is one way of thinking about it. Art tries to imitate, so mimesis, the copying, mimetic art. It's art that wants to copy reality. Pygmalion with the help of Venus, and that's another topic to talk about. People automatically assume it was Pygmalion who did it. Pygmalion was only able to do it because of the intervention of the goddess Venus. But the sign, signum in Latin, the statue, becomes its referent. In other words, the referent is the thing being referred to. It's what a sign is pointing towards. But Pygmalion makes the sign become the thing it's supposed to be referring to. There's no gap anymore between the two qualities. Whereas with Narcissus, what drives Narcissus and his desire crazy is the gap between the sign and the referent is permanent. The gap between Narcissus and his own reflection is permanent. He can never touch the thing that he desires. And that's the edge that the Otaku are playing on, I'd argue. Part of natural desire is that it can't be obtained. That's the nature of desire. The Otaku are recreating reality so that they can obtain the object of their desires, but the object of their desires are downgraded to dolls, representations, unrealistic representations of women. And I just think that's a whole interesting area to explore. And just to bring it full circle, in the Humphreys translation, this is in the Narcissus tale: charmed by himself, spellbound, and no more moving than any marble statue. So it's the complete opposite. The Pygmalion statue comes alive in Narcissus. The living Narcissus gets reduced to the status of a statue and ends up dying. And his bones, according to the myth, become the rocks around the pool. So anyway, like I say, this has just been an overview. I've tried to cram an awful lot in, so apologies. But I'm going to start unpacking and exploring some of these ideas in a lot more depth. And what I want to show, I'll just finish with 2 final images. So this is the picture of Jerome was the artist for this, Pygmalion. And Jerome, I've seen a few of his paintings, and I think a modern expression of what Jerome is all about is it's the song It's All About the Bass, about the bass. He seems to have a thing about the bass. And I'm not even claiming Jerome is a brilliant artist, but like I say, if you pay attention to the way in which at the bottom of the statue, the Pygmalion statue is coming out of the rock. I'll just finish with one final image that shows the anime Otaku type version of this, and what makes me think there's still a lot more to explore in the relevance of the 2 things together. So I'll just finish with one more image. Until the next time, all the very best. Take care.